Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so excited to be talking to the wonderful Julianne Nicholson about her latest film, Janet Planet. And starting off, I wanted to talk about a lot of the communication that you and Annie Baker had in pre-production, who's the writer and director of this film, because I've heard that the two of you were kind of in constant communication for about a year during that process. And I was really curious about what a lot of those conversations looked like, or what some of the details about your character were that really helped you to finesse and find.
Yeah, it felt like such a luxury to have that time to sort of just gently get to know each other and get to know who Janet was, or start getting to know who Janet was. So our communication was lots of mostly um shared memories because we had both grown up in this part of the world. And so I'm 10 years older than Annie, so mine was more in the 80s, and the story takes place in 1991, but much of the area was sort of unchanged in that time. So it was, we would send old photos to each other. Or for instance, I remember some of her, she would send me like inspiration. One of them was of this particular farm in Montague, Massachusetts, where my best friend Sequoia lived. And so it was just felt all very personal. Or so we would send photos of books that were on our mom's shelves, or a body cream that was all like in every bathroom for 20 years. Or so it was all just getting really into the details of the world and the time and the place. Um, and then from there, just going a little bit deeper into who we thought Janet was, or where she came from. And yeah, it was just a way of getting to know each other as, actor and director, and also both of us getting to know Janet, the character.
And you flew out and spent some time on location in the house where it was filmed, which is the main setting for the movie as well, before production started. What was kind of like the shift for you once you got onto location and were just immersed in it, that it really helped you to just settle into differently?
I would say it was much of it was that house. I mean, we spent so much time in that house, and it just had its own energy. It was also, like 95 degrees all summer long, so that really set a tone and a pace for everyone behind and in front of the camera. But to have the luxury of time beforehand, when you go to a location for in this situation, go beforehand, it just plants those seeds earlier. So there's already something in your body, there's something familiar happening that just deepens um, before you get there to actually, have the cameras rolling. So that was really fun. We went to Mount Pollux, which is in the movie is where Janet and Avi have their date. So went there, went and did, hikes and laid in hammocks and just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked.
I love that you had that luxury of time to be on location as well. And also wanted to ask about the training that you did in acupuncture, because your character is an acupuncturist, but then there's the really interesting detail of she's had a lot of jobs over the years, and she was just licensed 4 years ago, so it's still something fairly new. And so during the acupuncture training that you were doing, how did that help you tap into that space of who she is, but also with that lens of she's only been doing this for the last few years?
Well, that's a comfort, right? It's because if you've been doing it 25 years, then I'm sure like holding the needles would feel different in her hand. So I felt like that was very forgiving that she'd only been doing it for like 4 years. So I worked with an acupuncturist out there. I was her patient, which I loved. And then I've had acupuncture before. I love acupuncture. And then it was just getting the hang of using those needles. And she gave me needles to bring home, different lengths of needles. I would do it either like into a pair of jeans or into a pillow, and just so that I could do it while I was watching TV or while I was sitting there, just so that it felt sort of, as much as second nature as it could feel. And so that it wasn't like when I was doing it, I was like, thinking too hard about, or like trying to remember too precisely what was supposed to happen, but have it be more like organic. And also Will Patton, who I have to put needles in, was very gracious. And we had another session with the acupuncturist where she showed me how to do it on him. And it was just mostly, time and trying to get the hang of it. And my mom is an herbalist and started in the like late 70s, 80s when it was still a very new thing. And so I felt like not necessarily her, but I've met people in that world at that time who were just starting off on these careers. And it's very interesting to have an understanding of why people get into like alternative lifestyles, especially then, when it was so sort of, people were very skeptical about it at that time. Even in the 90s, I feel like acupuncture wasn't what it is today, where it's like second nature for somebody. If somebody says they're going for acupuncture, no one's going to bat an eye. Whereas in the 90s, there was still a curiosity and an unknown about it. So that all informed that.
And with the fact that you're playing this character who throughout the course of the movie, like we were just discussing, she's kind of dipped through different careers in her life, but we also see her, the way that she kind of dips in and out of relationships. How did you set about thinking, how much do I feel like she absorbs into slightly different identities for different people and different phases of her life versus what are the elements of her that are going to remain stagnant and stay the same throughout?
Right. I feel like this particular summer is a real magnifying glass on that instinct to sort of change based on who she's with and trying to get love or validation or recognition or, that she's okay. So I feel like that this particular time in her life is much more about like outside, trying to find that outside of herself. But I do also feel like, you know, I feel like she's a single mom in the early 90s doing the best that she can and loves her daughter. And, I feel like parenting looks different now in 2024 than it did in 1991. But she's definitely, even if they don't have the most sort of like boundaried relationship or even the most like comfy cozy like cuddle relationship, there's a real love and bond and protection and sense of security that and a sense of purpose that Lacy gives Janet.
And I love that there's such an intimacy in her relationship with her daughter, but then she also gives her daughter space to kind of mature on her own. When we first see Janet go to pick her up from the camp, she's not immediately running over to her while she's saying goodbyes, or when she drops her off at the school bus, she's not walking her to the bus stop. So there's these like little semblances of you have your own space to kind of be independent, but then at the same time, they cuddle up in bed at night together and fall asleep in each other's arms, telling each other secrets.
Yeah.
And so what did you want like the closeness and the intimacy to look like alongside that element of independence as well?
Yeah, well, I think that I mean that's an interesting thing, especially in that particular relationship, like a single mom and a daughter. I mean, it's such an interesting one to me. Because the need, I mean, this is generalizing, of course, but I've witnessed, and I feel like in particular this story, like the need is so great for each other. And boundaries get blurry. And in 1991, it wasn't so much like there wasn't as much helicopter parenting, I would say. So it is trying to give the freedom to be their own person in the world too. I feel like that's sort of very much on the heels of the 60s and 70s and feminism, and even Janet saying like, the desire to be liked is a very female thing. And I think she's trying to like push, even though she like embodies that, I think she's also doesn't want that for her daughter, and trying to sort of break into another way of being and looking at relationships between, in particular, men and women.
It's such an interesting point about the time period as well and how that really interacts into it. And the way that they talk to each other as well, it's very much that Lacy is also a confidant as much as she's her daughter, and she talks to her in very real terms. She doesn't talk down to her as a kid. It's we're having a very adult conversation about emotions and feelings, and we're both bringing things to the table that we're sharing. And so what was that kind of like sharing of maturity that felt important to the two of you to capture as well?
I think it's just a real close-up look on sort of the intimacy between a mother and her daughter, and for all its, all the good and the bads that come with that. Not to be too literal with goods and bads, but like it's a really interesting dynamic, I think. And yeah, it was fun to explore, you know. Also Lacy, such Zoe, the actress who plays her, and Lacy's such an intelligent child, like to talk to her like she was, you know, younger, wouldn't understand, just wouldn't have made sense.
Did you and Zoe Ziegler have much of an opportunity to kind of like immerse and spend a lot of time together during pre-production, or how did you kind of find
I
that dynamic?
Well, I wouldn't say a lot of time, but we did, you know, I reached out to her mom before we got there, and I would, you know, I would text Zoe a little bit, and I found out that, you know, she loves horses, and sent her a sweatshirt and brought Uno so that we could play cards. And we went to a river, and so like Annie would give us space to just be on our own. But a lot of it happened, I mean, we were there together all the time, of course, but a lot of it happened, you know, when the cameras were rolling. Sometimes there's something that happens that you can't even really, you know, put into words. But um, Zoe and Lacy, like Lacy is not Zoe, that Lacy is very much a character. And I feel the same about Janet. So it was very interesting to sort of discover like what that energy was between them that you can't really predict or even force.
And it's so wonderful when it just works out that way so organically as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I love them together. I think they're such a fascinating pair.
I know, and there's so many interesting parallels between the two of them. They're different ages, but there's so many kind of like different emotional beats that they're both experiencing at their stage in life. And you know, there's one conversation that they have where Lacy talks about, I find it really hard to make friends. I don't really have any friends. And when you look at Janet in the movie as well, we also don't really see that much of it from her. We see the one friendship with Regina, but that's someone that she hasn't seen for years. And we're not really seeing her kind of like immersed with community or immersed with friends around her. And so I was curious on your perspective, and if you felt like she did have these friendships that exist outside of the scope of the movie, or if you thought she was a little bit more isolated.
I think she's a little bit more isolated. I mean, I think she has a community, but I don't think it's like with deep connections. I feel like it almost feels like, yeah, I think that's what sort of lends to that intimacy being so intense between the two of them, because she's not necessarily finding that outside of the home. Yeah, I think she's probably in the process of sort of deepening her relationships outside the community, outside the home, like at the end of this movie. But definitely, I agree. I don't think she has many deep connections outside of the home. I think that's what lends to being so open and intimate with her daughter.
It's so wonderful in the movie. And also in terms of conversations that they have, there's that conversation where Janet's admitting, you know, I feel quite lonely and unhappy a lot of the time as well. And so just in terms of that as an emotional space for a character, how did you land upon choices of what does that look like for her? Because that looks so different in every person that's experiencing it.
Yeah. Um, I think it's honestly like just being human. It's like it's even in even with deep connections and family and love and support, it's actually quite a singular experience. So if I was looking at it sort of more like big picture like that, um, and she's had relationships, you know, friends and romantic over the course of her life, but hasn't figured a way out to maintain those things. And so that's lonely. That's a lonely place to be. But I also think that was lonely, like in that moment. It's not to say that she feels that every, you know, every moment of every day. I think that's like one aspect of her experience.
No, and that's such an interesting point about, you know, that kind of like want for love, but it being short term and never really kind of figuring out how to make it last, because there's that really, you know, heartbreaking line where she's talking about how she always knew that ultimately she could make any guy fall in love with her, but she also thinks that might be what destroyed her life. And I was just kind of curious how you saw her relationship with the idea of love, where it's something that she finds easy to grasp a little bit of, but can never kind of hold it and keep it.
Yeah, well, I felt like if you feel like you can find it with anyone, then like who's to say like why would you settle for anyone? Like if there's always another version of it or a different version of it, or you know, And I feel like she's still maybe going for the like sparkly love, and not necessarily like the grounded long haul do the work love. Um yeah, I know. I think that's a real, it's funny that, she's never said that before, but it comes out in that night. And I feel like it just sets her up for never being satisfied with what she has.
And in the way that Annie's filmed this, I love how there's just so many kind of like quiet little observational moments and vignettes throughout the film. But it's that idea of who you are in the small moments in life really builds into the bigger picture and the bigger idea.
Yeah.
It's what does it look like when they're in the bathroom getting ready for bed? What does it look like when they're just kind of like laying there having these little conversations? And so how did that idea of just being able to have very little like everyday moments as much as the bigger kind of like sweeping moments of emotion really help you in building such a fully fleshed out character?
Well, that's so interesting that you should say that, because I actually watched the film last night and I thought the same thing. And I mean, I have to say that's the director. That's Annie. You, you know what she said yesterday, she reminded me that the script that she wrote was only 70 pages. Like normally it's like one page equals 1 minute of screen time. And so for her, it's sort of more like one page equals 2 minutes of screen time. And so for her, it is fleshing out the characters and the place in those in between moments. And I feel like that really happens. I noticed that last night in this movie. Like it really is an accumulation of details, an accumulation of experiences. Like I feel like in particular with Janet, I feel like you feel like you have an in there, even though she's so mysterious and you never really know what she's thinking. There's so much going on all the time. But I feel like you see that kind of from pretty early on for Lacy. But I feel like Janet, it really is like a slow burn where you don't really get to sort of feel like you know who she is until like, maybe that's my experience because I'm playing it, but like until halfway through the movie and beyond. I don't know. I think that's a really interesting point you made though about like those little moments adding up. I
And
love
she's
that.
same. It's one of the things I loved about watching it. And I also love the way that she's directed it visually because it's such an observational quality in the way that she's using the
Totally.
camera. And
Yeah.
I feel like especially like we see your character a lot of times in the way that Lacy's looking at her, like even just thinking back to the opening scene where it's like we're seeing kind of like you and Wayne from behind in the way that Lacy's observing you both in the car seats. And so I was also interested in just kind of the relationship with the camera and the choices that Annie was making.
Yeah. I think well, so much of that it is, as you say, Lacy's the whole summer is basically taken through Lacy's point of view. So I feel like that was very intentional with Annie and Maria, our wonderful director of photography. And I love that. It feels very evocative to me of being a girl and how we look at our moms, if you have that luxury. Such an interesting dynamic, like seeing our moms as our moms, and then sort of making sense of them as actually like women in the world. It's really kind of mind-boggling to sort of think of them outside of the role as mother.
One of the framings that I loved in the film as well was that two shot with you and Sophie Okonedo when the two of you are just kind of like laying on the ground talking with each other.
Yeah.
And so I was curious in how even just the intimacy of the way that Annie positioned the two of you really helped in a scene like that, where it's just the two of them just unfurling their inner monologues and thoughts together.
Yeah, I thought that was really, I love that shot also. And I love that you don't see my Janet's whole face. Like so it's more of like you're getting more of the vibe than necessarily this one says this one says this. It's like not so much the conversation or the dialogue that we're listening, but more of like a moment that's being captured. Um yeah, that's Annie and Maria, and we just sort of we're along for the ride there. So lie here, okay. And then just, the idea of like what it would feel like to be high. What does that feel like? What could that feel like when it's so hot out, and breath, and a long time friendship, intimate friendship that, if being stoned has stripped down the walls in the years that they haven't seen each other, and they're sort of right back to that time when they were better friends or more connected. I love that shot. I think it's really pretty.
Right. And there's something so relatable about that idea of someone that you haven't seen for a long time, but you had a closeness with, and just the way that they kind of fully throw themselves in it to each other's arms again. And so for you, the idea that she's just immediately like, come stay with me, and opens her house, and, they dive back into that idea of deep friendship within a day. Was that also very reflective of the male relationships, and kind of wanting it to be the same idea of no matter what relationship it is, she throws herself in and out of them in the same rhythm?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's not just romantic relationships, but I think she has really romance on the mind, even if it's not like a sexual thing, but it's like the romance of a great girlfriend, or the romance of a love affair. Like, I think that's um something that she's probably had since a girl and has never gone away. So it's always like striving for that deep connection, intimacy, love, like the thing, the sparkle.
And there's so many conversations and things that she says throughout the movie that kind of give us an insight to the inner dialogue that she has with herself. And it feels like she's someone who struggles to be kind to herself in a lot of ways. When
Yeah.
she has that conversation where she's like, maybe I'm not someone who makes bad decisions. It's taken work for her to be that kind to herself. And that's why she gets so ruffled when she feels interrupted in that moment. And I was just interested in, looking at a character and your perspective of the way that she talks to herself, and the perspective that she has on herself a lot of the time, because it's something that everybody does.
Yeah, I thought that's heartbreaking. I think people are so unkind to themselves like often. So to sort of explore that felt very sort of bittersweet. And I'm glad she has that moment to sort of recognize that for herself. And hopefully, the recognition of it will help sort of dissipate it a little bit, make it a little easier to be more gentle with herself.
Definitely. And then through the different relationships that we see in these chapters, we also get to see what it looks like when she just suddenly has that moment where she's like, something just changed, and this is no longer the space that I want to be in. I think especially with Wayne, there's that moment where he kind of pushes Lacy out of the room, and you just see that look on her face. Annie just frames you in the camera, and we know in that instant that everything has changed. And so what did you want that look to communicate, and how did you want to find those moments of what does it look like for her when she's suddenly changed and that person is no longer going to be in her space?
Yeah, I think that was very intentional on Annie's part. Like, and as a mom myself, it's like it's on the page, but then you just imagine like somebody, there's a clear line in for Janet as to her daughter, and how people can be with her. And so I think when the wall comes down, there's no putting it back up. And I think Annie was very clear about wanting to capture that moment. So for me, it was just like imagining that, just being in that scene with incredible Will Patton, and exploring what that might feel like.
I also wanted to ask about the costumes for Janet as well, because she's in these kind of like very loose silhouettes and clothes that feel very attuned to the climate, but also like movement. It's very fitting of that idea of stepping into the world of acupuncture, and going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the way that she has a history of kind of adapting herself a little bit. I was interested if you felt like those were the outfits that she's always worn, or if that was another detail that sometimes changes a little bit throughout her life.
I think it probably changes a little bit throughout. I think it depends on where she lives. I think that those costumes are very particular to Western Mass in that time. And as you say, like the job that she's doing, where it's about like flow and comfort and like a little bit body conscious, but not too much. I think she's had probably many different looks over the course of her life.
And did you think of her as well as someone who, because of this like real need and want for love in the way that she has it, that also there's kind of that people pleasing element? Because there's a moment where Abby's asking, oh, did Lacy like the show that we did? And she doesn't even ask Lacy for her opinion. She's like, yes, she liked it. It's like everything's great. We're all having a wonderful time.
Yes. Yes. I think that's a big part of it. People pleasing and wanting to, make sure everybody's okay, everybody's comfortable. I remember Annie talking about that when one of the first scenes that we filmed, actually, one of the first dinner scenes that we filmed with Wayne and Lacy, where, Lacy asks Wayne about if he has any more kids, and Janet like can't stand the silence. So she's like, he has a son, and he's a lovely son who's 20. Like those are uncomfortable. And it's like, so fill the silence so nobody has to feel it as discomfort. So I think it's very much people pleasing. It's very much wanting to be loved. It's very like old, like learned behavior.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating character with so many different emotional layers to unpack, and that's exactly what I loved about the film. So congratulations on the movie, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you liked it. So nice to talk to you again. Thank you.